That night, I was on my usual patrol, a quiet stretch of highway that cuts through the middle of nowhere, the kind of place where your mind plays tricks on you, especially around 2 in the morning. I'd been on the job for 10 years, long enough to know that most nights are the same, uneventful, routine. But there was something different about that night, something I can't quite put into words, even now. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and the night was darker than usual. It felt like my headlights were slicing through solid black, barely managing to push back the darkness. The radio had been mostly silent, just the occasional crackle. But then a call came through. Single-car accident, a few miles down the road. I acknowledged the call, and as I did, a chill ran down my spine. For a moment I hesitated, which wasn't like me at all. But I shook it off, took a deep breath, and headed toward the scene. The drive felt longer than it should have. I kept glancing into the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something there. Something that shouldn't be. I tried to brush it off. Tiredness, maybe. Or just the eerie silence of the night playing tricks. But when I finally arrived, I saw the car, and I knew this wasn't going to be a normal call. The wreck was bad, real bad. The car was a crumpled mess of metal, half buried in a ditch, headlights still on, casting an eerie glow over the scene. I parked a few feet away, got out, and approached cautiously. That's when I noticed it. Standing just off to the side of the car, barely visible in the darkness, was a figure. Tall, still, almost blending in with the shadows. For a second I thought maybe it was a witness, or the driver. But as I got closer, something felt off. I reached for my flashlight, the beam slicing through the dark, but when I pointed it where the figure had been, there was nothing. Just empty air. I scanned the area, my heart beating a little faster. Maybe they'd run off. Maybe I was just seeing things. I was about to chalk it up to the late hour and approach the car, when something flickered in my peripheral vision. I turned sharply, my flashlight catching movement. There, a few feet away, stood the figure again, more distinct this time. I could see it more clearly now. It was definitely human-shaped, but there was an unnatural stillness to it, like it wasn't really there. And then I saw its eyes, 2 pinpricks of red, glowing softly in the darkness. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I've faced down plenty of scary things in my life, but this was different. There was no sound, no movement, just those eyes staring right at me, unblinking. The figure took a step forward, and in that moment, my flashlight beam caught its face, or what was supposed to be a face. I could barely make out the features, but what I did see made my blood run cold. It was like looking at a reflection in murky water, distorted, shifting. And then I noticed what it was wearing, a uniform similar to mine, but old, tattered. And that's when it hit me. I'd heard the stories, we all had, at the precinct, about an officer who'd died in the line of duty on this very stretch of highway, years ago. His car had been found just like this one, a twisted wreck in a ditch. The details were fuzzy, and no one really liked to talk about it, but there were always whispers that he never really left. I tried to convince myself it wasn't real, that this was just my mind playing tricks on me. But those eyes, I couldn't look away. And then as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished, just gone. I blinked, shone my flashlight around, but there was nothing. The night was still and silent again, as if it had never been there at all. I forced myself to focus, approaching the car. I could barely keep my hands steady as I checked inside. Empty. No sign of a driver, no blood, nothing. I called it in, my voice shaking, as I described what I'd seen, even though I knew how it would sound. I was losing it, seeing things that weren't there. But as I waited for backup, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. A noise, faint but distinct, broke the silence, like a radio crackling to life. I turned, and there, on the ground, was an old, battered police radio. It was one of the older models, the kind we hadn't used in years, the kind that officer would have used. I picked it up, and for a moment I heard something. Static, faint voices, like someone was trying to speak through a bad connection. I thought I heard my name. And then, nothing. Just silence. Backup arrived about 10 minutes later. They found me standing by the car, gripping that old radio like it was a lifeline. I must have looked like I'd seen a ghost, which in a way I had. I tried to explain what had happened, but how do you explain something like that? The others searched the area, but there was no sign of anyone else, no footprints, no evidence that anyone had been there at all. The car was eventually towed, and they wrote it off as a hit and run. But I knew better. I don't drive that stretch of highway anymore. I make excuses, switch shifts, anything to avoid it. Because every time I close my eyes, I see those red, glowing eyes staring back at me. And I hear that faint crackle of the radio, a whisper from the dark, reminding me that some things never really leave. They're just waiting, watching, and one night, they might decide to make themselves known again. I don't know what I saw that night, or what it wanted, but I do know this. There's a thin line between our world and whatever's on the other side, and sometimes that line isn't as solid as we'd like to think. I've seen my fair share of unsettling things on the force, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened that night on Elm Street. It was supposed to be a routine call, just another Friday night. A neighbor reported strange noises coming from a house. Owners out of town, lights off, front door left ajar. Standard stuff, right? Except, as soon as I stepped out of the patrol car, something felt wrong. Sarah Jenkins, my partner, must have felt it too. I glanced at her and she was already scanning the house, her hand hovering over her flashlight. The house stood there, 2 stories tall, dark and silent. But it wasn't the kind of silence you find in an empty home. It was deeper, heavier, like the air itself was holding its breath. We walked up the path, my boots crunching on the gravel. When we reached the front door, it was slightly open, just enough to let the night breeze slip through. I pushed it open, and immediately, a shiver ran down my spine. The air inside was frigid, unnaturally cold, and there was a smell, something sweet, almost sickly. It twisted my stomach. I called out, "Police! Anyone here?" Silence. Sarah and I exchanged a look. We knew the drill. Move slow, stay sharp. We cleared the first few rooms. Kitchen, dining room, living room, all empty. Nothing out of place, nothing to suggest a break-in. But that sense of unease, it kept growing, like something was watching us, waiting. Then we heard it. A crash from the kitchen. My heart skipped a beat, and I swung around, gun drawn. A glass had shattered on the floor, shards glittering under the moonlight filtering through the window. "Did you see that?" Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper. I didn't answer. I didn't have one, because I hadn't seen anything. No one was there. But that glass hadn't fallen by itself. We moved on, sweeping each room, making our way down the hall. As we stepped into the living room, a grandfather clock against the wall began to chime, its deep, hollow sound echoing through the space. It was strange because I hadn't noticed it before, and yet, there it was, ticking away like it had been there for years. The room seemed to grow colder with every chime. I don't know why, but I glanced at the mantelpiece. There was a framed photograph there, a family portrait. Something about it caught my eye, and I realized it was turning. Slowly, ever so slightly, it was rotating, as if someone was gently twisting it. I stepped closer, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, when a scream tore through the silence. It was a sound that made the hair on my arms stand up, a high, desperate wail that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Sarah and I bolted for the stairs, guns raised. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear anything else. As we reached the top, a door at the end of the hall slammed shut with a force that rattled the walls. "Police! Open up!" I shouted, my voice cracking with adrenaline. Silence answered me. I kicked the door open, my pulse thrumming in my ears. It was a child's bedroom. The room was dark, lit only by the faint glow of a streetlight outside. Toys were scattered across the floor, and in the corner, a small wooden rocking horse was swaying gently, as if someone had just pushed it. But there was no one there. The room was empty, except it didn't feel empty. Sarah stepped beside me, and I could see her breath in the cold air. "We should go," she said, but I could barely hear her over the pounding in my ears. And then we both heard it, a whisper, soft and menacing, like it was coming from just behind us. "Get out." We spun around, but there was no one there. My mind was racing. I didn't know what to do, what to think. Every part of me was screaming to run, but my feet wouldn't move. And then I heard it again, clearer this time, like someone was breathing right down my neck. "Get out." I grabbed Sarah's arm, and we backed out of the room, down the stairs and out of the house. We didn't stop until we were standing outside, gasping for breath. The house loomed behind us, dark and silent once more, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from the windows. We radioed it in, filed our report, but it felt hollow, like nothing we could say would explain what had happened in that house. We didn't mention the photograph or the whisper. I don't know why. Maybe we were afraid no one would believe us, or maybe we just didn't want to believe it ourselves. The next day I looked up the address. The house had been empty for years. The family in the photograph, they were gone, had been for a long time. Tragedy, they said, the kind that leaves a mark. I've been back on Elm Street a few times since then, driving by on patrol. Every time I pass that house I can feel it, like a weight pressing down on my chest. It's still there, still watching, waiting. And every time I keep driving, because I know I'm not going back inside. Whatever we heard that night, whatever whispered to us, it wanted us out, and I'm going to do everything I can to stay out. I was on patrol that night, just like any other, cruising the lonely backroads of Texas. My name is Officer David Ramirez, but everyone calls me Dave. It was past midnight, the kind of hour when the world feels like it's holding its breath, and all you hear is the hum of your own engine. I've done this route 1,000 times. I know every bend, every bump in the road, and every shadow that flits across the headlights. But that night was different. I was halfway through my shift, mind wandering, trying to stay alert. It was a clear night, no traffic, nothing unusual. Then I saw her, a young woman, standing by the side of the road, in a white dress that seemed to glow in the dark. She had her thumb out, a hitchhiker, not something you see often out here, especially at this hour. I slowed down, my mind already debating whether to stop. It's against regulations, picking up hitchhikers, but she looked vulnerable, like she needed help. I rolled down my window. "You all right, ma'am?" I called out, trying to sound more confident than I felt. She stepped closer, her face still shrouded in shadows. "My car broke down a few miles back," she said, her voice soft, almost a whisper. "Could you give me a lift to the nearest gas station?" I hesitated. I knew I shouldn't, but something in her tone, a kind of quiet desperation, tugged at me. "All right, get in," I said, reaching over to unlock the back door. She slid into the back seat, and as she did, I felt a sudden chill, like someone had opened a freezer door. I glanced at the temperature gauge. Nothing out of the ordinary. Just the night air, I told myself. We drove in silence for a while. I kept glancing at her in the rearview mirror, trying to get a better look, but the dim light made it hard to see her clearly. She was just there. Pale skin, dark hair, and that white dress, like something out of another era. "Where are you headed?" I asked, more to fill the silence than anything. She gave me the name of a town, about an hour away. I nodded, even though it didn't make sense. Why would she be out here, in the middle of nowhere, so late at night? As we drove, I kept stealing glances in the mirror. Every time I looked, she seemed different, fading almost, like she wasn't really there. I rubbed my eyes, thinking maybe I was just tired. But the chill in the car was getting worse, creeping under my skin, making my hands tremble on the wheel. Then she spoke again, her voice echoing in the silence. "It happened right here, you know." "What did?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "The accident," she said, barely above a whisper. "Years ago. Right here on this road." My heart skipped a beat. There have been accidents on these roads, sure, but how would she know that? I glanced in the mirror again, and this time my stomach twisted into a knot. Her face was clearer now, and there was something wrong about it. Her eyes were dark, hollow, like they were swallowing up the light. And her skin, it looked almost translucent, as if she was fading away right before my eyes. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white. "What accident?" I asked, even though a part of me didn't want to know. "The one that took my life," she said, her voice so soft I almost missed it. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching on the asphalt. The car skidded to a stop, and for a moment, everything was silent. I turned around, my heart pounding, expecting to see her sitting there, staring back at me. But the back seat was empty. I whipped my head around, scanning the road, the bushes, the empty fields stretching into the dark. There was no one. Nothing. Just the night, cold and quiet, and my own ragged breathing. I sat there, frozen, trying to make sense of it. Had I imagined the whole thing? Was I losing my mind? I glanced at the rearview mirror again, half expecting to see her there, but all I saw was my own pale, terrified face. I reached for the radio, my hand shaking, but I couldn't bring myself to call it in. What would I even say? That I'd picked up a ghost, that I'd lost it out there on the back roads? I sat there for what felt like hours, the engine idling, the cold seeping into my bones. Finally, I forced myself to drive on, my eyes darting from the road to the mirror, waiting for her to reappear. But she didn't. I drove all the way to the nearest gas station, pulled into the empty lot, and just sat there. I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still with me, that if I turned around I'd see her sitting there, staring at me with those dark, hollow eyes. I didn't go back to that road for a long time after that. I stuck to the busier routes, the ones with streetlights and other cars, where the night didn't seem quite so dark. But every now and then, when I'm out there, late at night, I still think about her. I wonder if she's still out there, waiting for someone else to stop, to give her a ride, to listen to her story. And I wonder if she'll ever find peace, or if she's doomed to haunt those empty roads, a lonely hitchhiker in a white dress, forever searching for a way home. I wish I could say I've forgotten her, that I've convinced myself it was just a trick of the mind. But I haven't. I can still hear her voice sometimes, late at night, when the road is quiet and the darkness seems endless. "It happened right here," she said, "and I'll never forget it."